The existence of God can be proved, but not demonstrated.
It can be proved by the same method that a man is proved guilty of theft in a court of law, when neither judge nor jury have seen the theft committed, and the thief has not been caught in the act of stealing. Under these circumstances, the thief is proved guilty by reasoning from evidence gathered at the scene of the crime or from other sources. His guilt is not demonstrated beyond all possible doubt, because his crime was not seen. There is a remote chance that someone else committed it, but the court is assured of his guilt because there is no flaw in the chain of reasoning that concludes his guilt from the evidence. In the same way, the existence of God cannot be demonstrated beyond all possible doubt, because he cannot be seen. He is invisible and intangible. But from the evidence of the universe and of our five senses, we can prove the existence of God by the same method that would satisfy a court of law in the case of a crime. We can prove it by a chain of reasoned arguments in which there is no flaw. The argument can only be contested by doubting the evidence of our senses and the principles of reason, which is to say, by committing intellectual suicide. For once we doubt our own senses and the laws of reason, intelligent thought and discussion about life become impossible. Since modern philosophers have taken this doubt seriously, philosophy has largely degenerated into a profitless and unfruitful wrangling, not about life, but about the processes of thought, about whether anything can be known at all. It is not presumption to attempt to prove the existence of God by reason. It is, on the contrary, the duty of reason, and the chief purpose for which this faculty is given to us. Those who can reason have no excuse for doubting the existence of God, for, in the words of St. Paul, the invisible things of God, since the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even his everlasting power and divinity, that they may be without excuse. We are cowed monkeys, it is said, typing for long enough on enough typewriters would be bound eventually to write the Bible. This is to say, therefore, that blind and unconscious elements are a sufficient cause for this universe, provided that they are able to combine and recombine haphazardly for a sufficient length of time. By pure statistical necessity, a human mind will eventually be the result. What therefore we term mind, intelligence, and personality are in fact peculiar arrangements of atoms produced in course of time by blind necessity. To put it more simply, intelligence is a special form of unintelligence, and consciousness a special form of unconsciousness. Granting that this position is not already absurd, let us take it a step further. The individual who argues in this way is himself the product of blind necessity. His argument, which is part of himself, is likewise the haphazard result of necessity. Because then his argument is part of the universe, he cannot claim for it what he denies to the universe, meaning. He can only claim that the meaning of his argument is a special form of meaninglessness. He is then saying that the presence of a thing, meaning, is a special form of its absence, or indeed that something is a special form of nothing. To deny intelligence to your own sufficient cause is to deny it to yourself. If all sense is in fact a peculiar kind of nonsense, man's intellectual suicide is complete. He might just as well be reciting Jabberwocky as propounding philosophical theories. Furthermore, his entire argument began with a huge begging of the question. Quite arbitrarily, he has termed the principal substance of the universe blind and unconscious. This is a mere guess, for he admits he does not know what substance is. Why then does he make this assumption? Because he wishes to deny his own spiritual and rational responsibility, because he finds it morally inconvenient to admit that he is what he seems to be, a free, rational, and conscious person. By showing that he and all his thoughts and deeds are the results of blind necessity, he can renounce responsibility for himself. But not only does his argument begin with a purely arbitrary assumption, it ends in the denial of its own rationality and meaningfulness. But the argument for the existence of God begins with an assumption that is not arbitrary, an assumption that we make naturally and are compelled to make in order to live any kind of rational life. It begins with the evidence, or assumption, if you insist, of sense, feeling, and intuition, that man is a conscious, intelligent, responsible, and relatively free person. We have therefore to account for the appearance of this intelligent and self-conscious thing called a person. Personality cannot be explained as a special form of impersonality, any more than the playing of a violin can be explained as the mere scraping of a cat's entrails with horsehair. The emergence of human personality from the universe must have a sufficient cause, which is to say a cause that itself has the property of personality. The cause of personality must be at least personal. Since the lesser cannot of itself make the greater, the presence of a thing cannot be explained in terms of its absence, and something cannot come out of nothing. Make it infinitely absurd. There must therefore be a first cause that is not an effect of anything but itself. And this, concludes St. Thomas, men call God. There is nothing in the universe that exists in its own right. For of all things that we know, it is possible for them both to be and not to be. Obviously, a thing that has the possibility of not existing does not exist necessarily in its own right. If it existed necessarily, it could never cease to exist. If, then, things do not have being in their own right, they must derive being from something else, a series of beings, none of which exist in their own right, all of which derive their existence from one another, is by itself impossible, however enormous it may be. If every being in the series derives its existence from something else, the whole series must also derive its existence from something else. For a being that can at some time not exist is not an eternal being, and no number of temporal beings will add up to an eternal being, just as no number of geometric points will add up to a line, and no amount of shapes will make a color. But if there is no eternal being, there was a time when things were not, in which case they could never have come into existence. Therefore there must be an eternal being that exists necessarily in its own right, which does not have being, and so can possibly not have it, but which is being. And this, too, is what men call God. The fourth proof is based on the different grades of perfection to be found in things. There are, for example, varying degrees of warmth and of consciousness. Things are understood to be more or less warm or more or less conscious to the extent they approach that which is most warm and most conscious. Something that is less warm cannot become more warm by itself. The extra warmth must come from somewhere, and that can only be from what is most warm, i.e., fire in one form or another. We are saying, in fact, that there cannot be less or more of a given quality or perfection until there is a most, from which the less and the more can be derived. If there is not a most perfect form, that the less and the more perfect can be derived, we are saying that the greater can be explained in terms of the less, that more of a given quality is the result of less of it, which is manifest nonsense. Therefore all perfections in all things must be explained with reference to a most perfect being, that does not receive perfection from another, but that possess the fullness of these perfections in its own right. Man is more conscious than the animal. Man, however, is not the most conscious, because animals do not derive their consciousness from man. Thus, the necessary most conscious and most perfect being will be what we call God. The fifth proof comes from the fact of a certain order in unintelligent things. A type of order that is not simply read into them by the human mind. For example, the eye of a bird is ordered toward seeing. The power of sight is for the good of the bird. Yet certainly the bird has neither the intelligence nor power to produce its own eye and order it to the perception of light as distinct to the bird hourly would be contrary to every reasonable idea of the divine perfection and justice if man were capable of loving God but not of union with him. The good news, the gospel of the Christian religion, is precisely that God has given man the power to receive this union, to become one life with God, and to share and enjoy eternally his unopposed goodness, love, peace, and happiness. The realization of this union is what is meant by going to heaven. And the imagery of wings and harps and halos, of the celestial city, whose temple, light, and center is God, of the unending song of praise and adoration, is designed to tell us in symbolic form of the joy and illumination of those who have become one with God and transfigured into his radiance like iron plunged into fire. Human reason, just because it is human and not divine, cannot be absolutely perfect, and consequently the reasoned proof of God's existence and the reasoned deduction of what his nature must be cannot have absolute certainty. Two things, however, may safely be claimed. First, it is clear that belief in God is more reasonable than any other theory of ultimate reality that human reason has to offer. To suspend judgment on the bare chance that this reasoning may not be true is like refusing to go out of the house because of the much stronger chance that you may be hit by an automobile. It is 1,000 times easier to prove that you can trust in God than that you can trust yourself to the hazards of a city street. People do the latter every day. That they do not do the former can only be attributed either to inability to reason or to sheer moral cowardice, or in some cases to mere lack of information. Secondly, it is also clear that a reasoned consideration of God's existence and nature shows that this central doctrine of Christianity, together with its necessary implications, is not at all the crude, naive, and superstitious notion it is currently supposed to be. The Christian Church does not teach that the ultimate reality is a cosmic Superman with white whiskers who sits upon a golden throne above the stars. Nor, however, does it commit the opposite folly of supposing that God is merely the personification of our highest ideals, who exists only in the sense of Uncle Sam. It does not even ask us to believe in God as a gaseous vertebrate, or as a rather large, ubiquitous, and beneficent superspook. On the contrary, it carries human reason to the highest, the most sublime, the most subtle idea that it can form, and having taken it to that splendid height, makes it bow down in wonder and humility. The philosopher with the child, because on the very topmost peak, one thing becomes certain beyond all else, that the reality so far surpasses the idea in glory that all human knowledge is seen as comparative ignorance, and the curious chatter of thought becomes the loving silence of contemplation.